that are really foundational. You see, Chapter 6, Section 1 begins with George Washington. George Washington setting up and heading and running this new government. Now as President Washington, no longer general, no longer presiding officer at the Constitutional Convention, now United States President George Washington was very transformational in forming the ideas of the Constitution into a real and functioning government. Now, the very first concept we're going to look at is the Judiciary Act of 1789. This law, passed by Congress, created the U.S. Supreme Court as well as the entire judicial system. Now, the U.S. Constitution laid out the framework for a judicial system, and it was this law that put it into motion, creating the United States Supreme Court. It is the job of the U.S. Supreme Court to interpret the Constitution. It is the job of the U.S. Supreme Court to be the final hearing of any case in our country. They are the highest court of the land. State court decisions can be appealed to the United States Supreme Court. And it's, of course, formed the judicial branch of our government. Now, the executive branch. This was generally formed and organized by George Washington and his cabinet. When Washington was elected the first president of the United States in 1789, he and his vice president were the first chief executives of our new nation. There was no president from 76 until 89. And now we have a president. Now we have a leader. And so Washington got to pick his first advisors, but Congress created the first cabinet positions: the office of state, the office of war, and treasury. Alexander Hamilton became the first Secretary of the Treasury. In fact, it was his financial plan for the government that is going to create the first Bank of the United States. George Washington also created an Attorney General, a chief law enforcement officer of the country, and these department heads are the very first cabinet, the very first formal advisors to the President of the United States.
Following the guidelines that were written in the new Constitution, George Washington of Virginia was elected to be the first President of the United States of America, and John Adams of Massachusetts was chosen to be his Vice President. 2 months after his election, George Washington, at the age of 57, was inaugurated President. He was about to begin the extraordinarily difficult task of leading the world's only democracy, a type of government that hadn't been tried for a very long time. In fact, democracy had succeeded just once, and that was for a brief time back in ancient Greece. In 1789, the year Washington was elected, U.S. territory extended from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, far beyond the boundaries of the original 13 colonies. Even so, most of North America was not under the control of the United States, for to the north in Canada lay territory controlled by Great Britain, while to the south and west lay territory mostly claimed by Spain. America's nearly 4 million citizens were spread over a very wide area, and the new federal government would serve to unify them all. It would collect taxes, regulate and oversee certain activities of their states, and it would also defend them in times of war. America's first president was a man very much beloved by the citizens of his country. He was a brave man who had led the Continental Army to victory over the British in the War for Independence. And he was a highly respected political leader who had presided over the convention that drew up the U.S. Constitution. Before Washington could start to carry out his duties as president, the United States Congress had to do two very important things required of it by the Constitution, and that were essential to a properly functioning national government. The first was to establish the executive departments. These were the departments of State, Treasury, and War that were to be directly under the President's control. The second was to establish the federal court system that Congress created by passing the Judiciary Act of 1789. One of Washington's first jobs as president was to appoint the people who would head these newly created departments. He chose Thomas Jefferson, minister to France during the Revolutionary War, to be his Secretary of State. Jefferson would deal with the nation's relations with foreign countries. Alexander Hamilton, a trusted military aide during the Revolution, was chosen to be his Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton would deal with the nation's financial matters. Henry Knox, a Revolutionary War hero, was selected to be his Secretary of War. Knox would oversee the nation's defense. The heads of the three executive departments were the president's closest personal advisors and made up his first presidential cabinet. Furthermore, President Washington nominated John Jay, a prominent lawyer and figure in New York politics, to be Chief Justice of the new Supreme Court, the nation's highest court. And as Washington continued to choose people to serve in the federal government, James Madison, United States Representative from Virginia, proposed 10 amendments to the new Constitution called the Bill of Rights that were designed to safeguard personal freedoms.
Now, from the very beginning of our country, there was a division. And we've been discussing this division throughout Chapter 5, the Anti-Federalist versus the Federalist. The Federalist who believed in a strong central government maintaining a balance of power between the states and the federal government. And this idea was championed by Alexander Hamilton. In fact, it would be him who comes up with the idea for the Bank of the United States to create a national currency, to create a strong central government. But he also believed that this government should be led by the wealthy and educated who could act on behalf of their less talented and gifted brethren. Thomas Jefferson strongly disagreed with this belief. In fact, he championed the anti-federalist ideal. So Hamilton might have been a student of Plato who believed in the enlightened monarch or the enlightened despot, that the wealthy and educated and talented top 10% must lead the rest of society. Jefferson believed that everyone should be responsible for their own fates, and that this could best be accomplished through strong state and local governments, that individual liberty perhaps was even more important than the stability of a strong national government. And so he believed that individual citizens' participation in a democracy was paramount to its success. Meanwhile, Alexander Hamilton has the support of the North. Many people in the North believed in this idea of a strong central government. Generally, people in the South and people in the Western territories were anti-federalist, supporting Jefferson's idea of a weaker central government and stronger state and local governments. Now, Hamilton's plan was to unite the country through a national currency, much like how the idea with the euro was to unite Western Europe through a strong central currency. And this was partly to affect the repayment of the U.S. national debt that had been incurred during the American Revolution. You see, the United States owed millions of dollars to foreign countries. In fact, it owed millions of dollars to private citizens, to Spain, to Britain, to France, but also to individual American citizens that had loaned the government money during the war. And so this debt had to be paid off. As we saw, in fact, there was a threat to the future of our country if we couldn't pay this debt. And so the plan was to pay the foreign debt by assuming it at the national level. You see, individual states had borrowed money separately. Virginia had borrowed money from France. North Carolina had borrowed money. Georgia had borrowed money. And so the nation was going to assume the debt of the states into a national bank, issuing a national currency.
Interestingly, the spot he chose was just a few miles upstream from his home at Mount Vernon. Once the site had been chosen, a French engineer was hired to design the layout of the new city, which was to be based on a distinctive system of radiating boulevards. In 1791, Congress approved the creation of a privately owned bank called the Bank of the United States to handle the federal government's money. Alexander Hamilton had personally worked to have this bank created, for he believed it would help strengthen the government politically and economically. But Thomas Jefferson deeply opposed the bank, believing it to be a government-supported monopoly. Soon another issue arose that divided these two men, for Hamilton wanted the federal government to take an active role in promoting the development of American industry, and Jefferson did not. At this time, industrialization was just beginning to take hold in America. In fact, the factory in Rhode Island seen here, called Slater's Mill, opened right around the same time Hamilton was making his proposals to Congress. It was the first factory in the nation where water-powered machines were put to use in textile manufacturing. Machines like those in Slater's Mill had brought tremendous wealth to Great Britain, and Hamilton wanted the same thing to happen in the United States. To achieve this goal, Hamilton wanted the federal government to make payments to people who opened new factories, and to enact protective tariffs, special taxes on imported goods. Under this plan, there would be an added incentive to build factories, and untaxed American manufactured goods would become more affordable than similar foreign products upon which taxes were paid. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were disgusted with Hamilton's plan, saying it represented unnecessary government interference. It was their belief that the federal government should play only a small role in the lives of the American people. Furthermore, Jefferson believed that massive industrialization would breed poverty and the growth of crowded, unhealthy cities. In contrast to Hamilton, Jefferson envisioned an American nation based on small, independent farms, places where a much more wholesome way of life could be pursued.
Now, Hamilton's plan was for a national bank. And this national bank would be called the Bank of the United States. It would be funded by the federal government. It would be funded also by private investors. And like any other bank, it's going to take the money that people give to hold in trust, and it's going to invest that money. Yet there was a disagreement over congressional authority to establish a bank. Did Congress even have the right to do this? And so this began a serious debate over whether the Constitution should be interpreted literally, as Jefferson believed. He believed there was no constitutional basis for a national bank. Or should it be interpreted loosely, using the 9th and 10th Amendments, that if the Constitution did not explicitly forbid it, this would have been an implied power of Congress to create a national bank. And so we have this real debate. And so to win support for Hamilton's plan, he made a concession to the southern states. He said, look, if you will support this idea of a Bank of the United States, we will move the nation's capital. It had been in Philadelphia. After independence, it was moved to New York City. And now to sell this idea to the southern states, the nation's capital was moved to Washington, D.C. And so Washington, D.C. was the site of a former swamp. It was nothing. There was no town there. It was just empty marshland. And so a grand city was planned. And it was decided that by 1800, our nation's capital would reside in Virginia at the District of Columbia.
And as America struggled to put together its new government, a revolution broke out in France in July of 1789. The repercussions of the French Revolution came to have a profound effect on United States foreign policy throughout the 1790s. In January of 1790, the U.S. Congress met here at the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia, the place where the Declaration of Independence was signed. This building was to serve as the country's temporary capital while decisions about a new U.S. capital city were made. In 1790, one of the most urgent orders of business for the U.S. government was to come up with a way to repay long overdue debts incurred during the Revolutionary War, including such things as the back pay owed to soldiers. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton worked out a controversial repayment plan to meet this goal. But certain congressmen would only accept his plan if he arranged to have the new U.S. capital city built in the southern part of the country. A location in Maryland, pictured here, was decided upon, and Hamilton's repayment plan was passed. Then, not far from here along the banks of the Potomac River, President Washington selected the exact site where the federal city would someday stand.
And so this division between a strong central government or a weak central government, where essentially the state and local governments would do everything that the government would need to do. Jefferson believed that really the only purpose of a central government was to protect the people and promote the rights of the individual. And that's it. As long as a government can rally a defense if we are attacked, and as long as the government can ensure that your individual rights are guaranteed, that's essentially all that Jefferson believed a federal government needed to do. And in fact, if you remember, the Anti-Federalists were not even really sold on the idea of a central government in the first place. They were, in many cases, happy with remaining just a federation, just an alliance of different countries. And so this division between the Anti-Federalist and the Federalist goes on to become the very first political parties in our country. You see, Washington ran under the only single-party presidential election that we've ever had. He was a Federalist. In fact, he was running against other Federalists, but he won pretty resoundingly. There was no other party until Jefferson went on to found the Democratic-Republican Party. And opposing were, of course, the Federalists led by Alexander Hamilton. And this created the two-party system. But when the two-party system was created, President Washington warned that this would be dangerous to national unity and safety. In fact, he warned this could lead to a civil war if it continued.
In the end, Jefferson's view prevailed in Congress, and Hamilton's plan for the industrialization of America was defeated. Differing views on government, such as those voiced over the issue of industrialization, were what gave rise to America's first political parties, and by the time the national elections were held in 1792, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, and their supporters had formed the Federalist Party to promote their vision of a federal government that played a large and active role in American life. In opposition, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and their supporters had put together the Democratic-Republican Party to promote the idea of a country with a small federal government that rarely interfered in the lives of its citizens. While the first political parties were forming, 2 new states were added to the United States. Vermont was added in 1791, followed a year later by Kentucky, the 15th state to join the Union. 1791 was also the year the Bill of Rights was ratified by the states. And thanks to this document, Americans were guaranteed the basic freedoms of religion, speech, right to free assembly, the right to keep and bear arms, the right to a speedy trial, and so forth.
Now, of course, a new nation is going to have to deal with the question of taxes. Because big or small, no matter what the size of the federal government is, it's going to need funding to support it. And that's where we get our very first tax. And like so many of the tariffs that we saw before, it was a tariff. And the purpose of a tariff, a tax on imported goods, is to protect our nation's manufacturing base. Because for all those years that we were a colony, we were importing all the finished goods that we needed. And now that we are an independent country, many American investors saw an opportunity to become wealthy by creating some of our very first factories. And that's excellent. However, these very first factories struggled to produce goods at a competing price from the British manufactured goods, from the French manufactured goods, because they had had factories for much longer. They could produce goods much cheaper. And so to ensure the success of these American industries, our government imposed a tariff, a tax on imported goods, to make the foreign goods more expensive so that Americans would purchase American-made goods. But also we needed a tax on American people. The tariff wasn't going to pay for everything. And so we created what is called an excise tax, a tax on a product's manufacture, sale, or distribution. Effectively, this was the first sales tax. So of course you go to the store, you see what's on the sticker, you want the item, you expect to pay what's on the sticker, and there's of course a tax. We're just used to it now. Well, that tax on a product's sale, manufacture, or distribution was so upsetting to American people. In fact, so upsetting to a particular group of farmers, whiskey farmers. Because to make corn, or to make rye, or to grow agricultural products yielded a much greater profit if they turned those crops into alcohol. It was worth a lot more as alcohol than it was as corn, or as rye, or as barley, still today. And so these whiskey farmers actually staged a rebellion where in 1794 they refused to pay this tax. They got together in a big angry band of farmers, and when tax collectors would come, they would beat them up. And they would cover them in hot tar, and they would dump feathers on them, and they would send them back. And they threatened that if the U.S. government forced them to pay their taxes, they would secede. And so here we're already hearing secession, and we just got started. And here already farmers are threatening to leave the country over the issue of taxation. And George Washington rallied a militia, personally led this militia over the Allegheny Mountains into Pennsylvania, and put down the rebellion. And this demonstrated from our very first president that a strong central government could stop an insurrection. So today we'll be talking about Chapter 6, Section 2. And the title of this is Foreign Affairs Trouble the Nation. If you look at the textbook when you're reading this evening, you'll see a big painting. And it's a famous painting of the French Revolution, of the storming of the Bastille. The Bastille was a French prison containing political prisoners. They could put anyone in there for any reason and hold them indefinitely. And it became a symbol of everything that was wrong with France. And so the French citizens stood up to the leaders of the country, the wealthy, the powerful, the rich, the untouchable, and they stormed the high establishments, killing even the king and the queen and everyone with wealth and power. It was the French Revolution. It was an exciting time, but it was also a rather disturbing time for our country, and it was the first major foreign policy crisis that our new nation had to face. And so we're going to start with a little story about the French Revolution today in the latter part of the 1700s. Yesterday we talked about the beginning of political parties in our country. We learned about how the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist had extreme differences over the size and power of the federal government. And now we're going to see those differences. So the Federalists, who believed in this strong central government, who distrusted the common person to be able to make important decisions for themselves, tended to side with the British in their war against France. As we've talked, Britain and France were at war with one another throughout the centuries, and it was not uncommon. But when the French Revolution occurred, and the poor rose up against the rich, and the spirit of revolution just took fire in the country, and their slogan of liberty, equality, fraternity, equality for all was the foundation of a French democracy. But it was also kind of scary because the people, the poor, just rose up. It's almost like the Arab Spring, rose up and killed the wealthy and the powerful, and the guillotine was used to great effect. In fact, it was a French device invented during the time of the French Revolution. They started killing off all the wealthy and powerful. They called them the bourgeoisie and labeled them enemies. And this led to a scary time in France called the Reign of Terror, where a group called the Jacobins decided that anyone who was wealthy and powerful, anyone who would try to deprive the people of rights, needed to die. And they declared war on all monarchies, particularly Britain, their ancient enemy. And so France, again, at war with Great Britain. In the United States, George Washington, our president, said, "We're staying out of this. Not our fight." Declared neutrality. Meanwhile, our country was divided. There were a number of people who said that we need to help the French. There were a number of people who said, no, these French people are scary, we need to help the British. It was a divisive issue, not unlike what's going on with Syria today. Some people saying, we need to help the Syrians. Some people saying, oh no, we're staying out of this. And here we are. We're again split along, guess what? Party lines. The Federalists supported the British, who wanted to maintain stability, who didn't trust the Jacobins because they're killing all the rich people. And the rich people, according to the Federalists, are supposed to be the rulers of society. Meanwhile, the Democratic Republicans, remember the Anti-Federalists, Thomas Jefferson, the little government people, they were all about the French. They said, okay, what the French people are doing, cutting heads off, kind of scary. However, they are representing a movement of democracy, a movement of the people, by the people, and for the people. And even though their methods might be creepy, we need to support this idea. Meanwhile, the president, who obviously is in control of foreign affairs, declares neutrality. He wisely said, we're going to sit this one out, guys. Meanwhile, a French diplomat named Edmond Genet violates our neutrality, comes over to the United States without permission, and starts trying to recruit an army. He says, I know there's a lot of anti-federalists among you. I know there's a lot of people here that support the French cause, and I know that you would be willing to support democracy in France. And so he literally tries to raise an army illegally in the United States. Now, meanwhile, neutrality in foreign policy was a wise choice for a young country because we had many domestic problems of our own. And you could call these foreign issues too, because we had foreign nations living on our borders, and we were encroaching on their borders. And Native Americans were saying, them Americans taking our jobs, and they were taking our land, and they were moving into our territories. And we were. And, of course, the Treaty of Paris, the peace agreement that we made with Great Britain ending the War of the Revolution, included territories that belonged to Native Americans. If you remember, the Native Americans had not been invited to the peace agreement between the United States and Great Britain. And so many Native American tribes did not recognize that treaty because that treaty granted the American colonies lands from the coast all the way to the Mississippi River. Well, that includes the Ohio River Valley. That includes lands west of the Appalachians that the Cherokee claimed. That includes lands that belong to many different Native American tribes that had just been magic wand wave given to the American colonies. And that was unacceptable. In fact, a chief of the Miami tribe named Little Turtle, favorite name in the whole course, Little Turtle, was a war chief. And he had already led several successful campaigns against American armies. So Little Turtle was pretty hardcore. Meanwhile, he was undefeated. And he rallied a number of other tribes. And they called themselves the Miami Confederacy in honor of their leader, Little Turtle, from the Miami tribe. Now, the Miami Confederacy defeated several different American armies. This guy was jacked. I mean, I'm telling you, he's pretty amazing. Somebody needs to pick him for their big project, right? Study of Little Turtle. I don't know much about him, but I'd be very interested to hear because he was able to defeat 2 different American armies sent against him. The third time's the charm, right? Literally on the third time, we sent our very best general. He was called Mad Anthony Wayne. And it was his job to prepare the American army to defeat Little Turtle and the Miami Confederacy. And he drilled and trained his soldiers for over a year. Studied Little Turtle. Trained and prepared his men. And after a year's worth of training, they went after him. And at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the dreams of Little Turtle and the Miami Confederacy of maintaining their independence from the American Imperials.
I cannot take you seriously when you can't either.
At the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, Little Turtle and his Miami Confederacy were soundly defeated by Mad Anthony Wayne. They were forced to sign the Treaty of Greenville, giving up what is today the state of Ohio, because that's what they were fighting over, for a few $1,000s worth of beads and jewelry. True story. As we were growing as a country, we were making treaties with Great Britain and France and Spain, moving into their former colonial possessions. And due to wars in Europe, it became clear that European countries were going to begin to give up their North American territories and not seek to fight for them because there were troubles abroad in Europe related to the French Revolution that we'll get into more in just a moment. And so Great Britain began to relinquish control of their northwestern territories, particularly where they had troops stationed in forts. and they wanted these troops back in Europe to deal with some of the scary issues going on there. And they really didn't want to pick a fight with us because no country wants to fight two wars at the same time. That's a disastrous plan. That's what ruined Hitler. That's what ruined Napoleon. That's what's ruined many of the conquerors throughout history, fighting two wars at the same time. Britain knows better. They don't want to pick a fight with the United States because they know we are beginning to move into these territories, and so they make a treaty with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. His name is John Jay, made a treaty with Great Britain where the British agreed to evacuate their forts in the Northwestern Territory. In return, they were going to be able to continue the fur trade unopposed. And this angered many Americans because many Americans were beginning to side with the French in this war. And here we are making treaties with the British. So again, the Federalists were all about the British. We wanted to help them. We didn't really care what the French were doing. We supported the British because they represented stability in Western Europe. But again, that revolutionary fervor, the anti-Federalists, the believers in liberty, equality, fraternity, they tended to support the French. But we're going to see where this is going to cause even more division.
In 1794, Supreme Court Chief Justice John Jay was sent to London on a diplomatic mission. Its main goals were to bring an end to British interference with American trade ships and to clear up a variety of problems, some dating back to the end of the Revolutionary War. Under the treaty that Jay finally negotiated, Britain agreed to turn over forts being used to supply arms to American Indians who were trying to put a stop to U.S. settlement on their lands. These British forts were located in the western Lake Erie region near present-day Detroit and Toledo. Also under Jay's treaty, the United States agreed to stop carrying goods between France and her colonies. In exchange, the U.S. got a few minor concessions from Britain to limit its interference with American trade ships. However, as far as France was concerned, Jay's treaty merely showed that America was far from neutral because of its willingness to give in to British demands. And as a result, an undeclared war broke out between the U.S. and France.
So there's Little Turtle. Telling you, 350. Just say it. Many Native American chiefs wore feathers in their hair, as kind of a badge of honor for defeated enemies. But this is Little Turtle handing over symbolic control of the entire Ohio Valley, which is huge. Essentially the state of Ohio today, one of the breadbaskets of our country. Seriously, if you drive through the state, it's giant farms. As far as you can see, very fertile valley. And this is Matt Anthony Wayne, the colonial general who defeated the Miami Confederacy. So meanwhile, as I said, we are moving westward, for better or worse. And many of these lands had already been claimed by European nations, not to mention the Native American tribes that had lived there forever. But Great Britain, France, and Spain all realize that fighting the Americans for these lands was a bad idea. And so Spain began to negotiate with the United States, in particular Thomas Pinckney, the U.S. minister to Great Britain. And Pinckney's Treaty of 1795, also known as the Treaty of San Lorenzo, you might see either on your quiz or test. In this treaty, called Pinckney's Treaty, or the Treaty of San Lorenzo, Spain agreed to give up claims to the western United States. And these were sparsely populated territories at this time. We're talking about the territories west of the Mississippi. Now, Mexico is going to lay claim to much of this land when Mexico declares its independence from Spain soon. But meanwhile, Spain just agrees they're not going to fight the United States. They're not going to war with the United States over these territories. They also agree that the Florida and U.S. boundary is set at the 31st parallel and the Mississippi River would be open to United States traffic. And so if you remember when, during the Articles of Confederation, the United States was struggling to pay its debts, we owed Spain a lot of money. And because we couldn't pay Spain what we owed them, well, one consequence of that was they closed the Mississippi River to United States traffic. And this was a serious threat to our country because we didn't have railroads. We certainly didn't have semi-trucks. We relied on downriver shipments for transportation. And the Mississippi River was one of the most vital trade routes in our country. Well, it was largely claimed and held by the Spanish. And now with the Treaty of San Lorenzo, we can use it. And that's very, very good for us.
1 year after the Whiskey Rebellion, negotiations on some important issues were underway here in the Kingdom of Spain between royal officials and the representatives of the United States. Under the agreement that was finally worked out, called the Treaty of San Lorenzo, the Spaniards gave up trying to rule an area of disputed land that had been claimed by both the U.S. and Spain. And as a result, thousands of square miles of new territory were added to the United States. This land later became parts of the states of Mississippi and Alabama. In addition, the treaty prevented Spanish military forces from interfering with American trading ships on the Mississippi River. Even beyond that, the Treaty of San Lorenzo allowed American products and products destined for the American West to be loaded and unloaded here in New Orleans, which was then under Spanish control, without being taxed. Having free access to the Mississippi River proved to be extremely important to America because it increased both trade and settlement in the western region of the country. 1 year after the Whiskey Rebellion,
Now, meanwhile, the birth of the two-party system in our country has been very important to understanding American politics. The birth of the two-party system is very important in understanding American politics. And perhaps this is best understood through our first two-party based election. In 1796, we have the very first two-party election in our country's history. We have a Federalist, John Adams, who will go on to be our second president, versus Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican. Now, the Constitution allowed for a very strange phenomenon, and that is the president and the vice president can be elected from different parties. So essentially it was whoever won the election became President of the United States. And whoever came in second place became the Vice President of the United States. It's not anymore. This was changed. Yeah, I mean, imagine. However, the Constitution was written before the birth of the two-party system. And so in a single-party election, it makes sense because they would both be Federalist. Yet, now that we have a two-party system, we have a Federalist, John Adams, second President of the United States, as well as an anti-Federalist, Thomas Jefferson, who would later be third President of the United States, but for now he's going to be Vice President. And so they're from different parties. Can you imagine? I mean, in all seriousness. I mean, Trump and Hillary in the same office. Yeah, they don't exactly get along.
That'd be the end of the U.S.
I mean, yeah, like, can you imagine? Now, put our politics aside. Anytime you have two different parties in the same office, it's just kind of bad for business. It's the root of much of the troubles that we have in our legislature today, that not much can get done because we have two different parties in the same building trying to pass laws. And so really this is the result of what we see called sectionalism. And this is what Washington was warning about in his very last speech. He said, and I quote, "Beware of the dangers of sectionalism, because they will divide our country and lead to disunion and civil war." He said, beware of this. And sectionalism is placing the interest of the region of your country above the interest of our nation. And I was thinking about this last night. It's just one of those things that popped in my head. How did we convince independent states to put aside their special interest to become a nation? Because that's what we did with the signing of the Constitution. We convinced North Carolina to stop worrying about just North Carolina and to become a nation, and to put aside its special interest in the interest of a nation. But even though we supposedly did that with the Constitution, what we found was North Carolina still had its special interest and still voted along its special interest. And so did Rhode Island, and so did Massachusetts. And that problem didn't just go away with the signing of the Constitution, even as amazing of a document as it is. It didn't just go away. In fact, that sectional problem will become the American Civil War and will continue to plague and haunt our country, and still continues today. Unfortunately, division in our country didn't just end with the Civil War. It certainly didn't end with the signing of the Constitution. And so we're going to have that nagging problem throughout this course, and that nagging problem we're going to call sectionalism. Now back to Europe. Brief history of the French Revolution. The poor rose up against the rich, killed all the rich and wealthy, literally storming palaces and looting them, cutting kings' heads off. The rest is history. But after the revolution and after the reign of terror, Plato said that pure democracy becomes anarchy, which unfortunately we saw in France. They attempted to restore the monarchy out of a necessity of maintaining stability, and that didn't go so well. And eventually a French military officer named Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power and promised stability. Unfortunately, we see this. When you have a revolution and the people rise up, it often leads to instability. Look at the Arab Spring in 2011. Look at the Mexican Revolution, if you know your Mexican history. Look at many of the different revolutions around the world when the poor rise up against the powerful. And unfortunately, what often happens is anarchy and chaos, followed by a dictator. The dictator who promises stability. Think of Mussolini and Hitler. But in this case, we have Napoleon. Promises stability. Promises peace. And they often use war to unite their people. Because what brings a divided group of people together better than a good old war? Do you know one of the most united times in our country's history was World War II? What brings together a bickering nation better than Nazis? Than a good common enemy to hate? I'm serious. It's sad but true. Throughout history, a common enemy has united a divided people more so than any other phenomena. Maybe a natural disaster. Sadly, it takes terrible things to bring people together, and war is one of the most expedient and the most controllable of these. And so leaders will use war to bring people together. I mean, really, like think of the Star Wars prequel. Emperor Palpatine used war to unite the Republic, which was divided and scattered, into an empire, and before you know it, stormtroopers, right? Well, France turned to Napoleon, who then created a war and set out to conquer Western Europe. And he dang near pulled it off. And Britain was one of the few countries that was never conquered. Being an island nation has been advantageous to Britain throughout their history. And so Napoleon was never able to conquer Britain. So Britain and France in a terrible war with one another. And the French started to look at the United States as a threat. Gee, haven't we seen this before? World War I and World War II. Same problem, except instead of the Germans, now it's the French, who started to see the Americans as a threat because we were making treaties with their enemy, Great Britain. Again, it's the same problem you'll see in World War I and World War II. And so they started to seize American ships. Again, same problem before we were officially in either one of the world wars. They started to seize our ships. And they started to kidnap our sailors and steal our goods. And we saw this as a serious problem. And so it was a diplomatic crisis. And we hoped to resolve this diplomatically. We sent diplomats to France to discuss this with their new prime minister. And in order for us to even be able to meet with their foreign minister, they demanded a bribe. They demanded a large sum of money for us to even be able to sit down peacefully and talk. And so we were turned away. Our diplomats were turned away. And so we went back, our diplomats came back to the United States and reported that the French minister wanted a bribe. And 1,300 men, I kid you not, showed up at the White House with torches, volunteering to go fight the French. True story. So when word got out that the French wouldn't even talk to us, it led to a wave of anti-French feelings, and it led to an undeclared naval war between France and the United States for 2 years.
During his first year in office, President John Adams sent representatives to Paris to try to negotiate an end to the undeclared war between America and France. But the French demanded that the United States give their lives before they could even start talking. This event, that came to be called the XYZ affair, insulted the American negotiators so much that they sailed back home and saw to it that all treaties with France were repealed. That same year, in response to the growing threat of war, the ship seen here, USS Constellation, was built. The Constellation had 36 cannons and was the first U.S. Navy vessel ever to capture a foreign warship. The ship that it captured belonged to France. As the U.S. Navy was busy putting together its first fleet, President Adams' Federalist Party used its majority in Congress to pass a set of laws called the Alien and Sedition Act, designed to increase their political power. The three alien acts subjected new immigrants to unfair treatment and deprived many people who opposed the Federalists of their right to
We'll
vote.
get into this.
While the Sedition Act made it illegal to criticize the U.S. government. And when one newspaper editor suggested that some of John Adams' actions were a lot more like those of a king than a president, the editor was thrown in jail. James Madison, the man who composed the Bill of Rights, was one of the most outspoken critics of the Federalist attempts to undermine basic American freedoms. Madison and Thomas Jefferson both helped write the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which proposed that the Alien and Sedition Acts be ignored because they violated the U.S. Constitution. They suggested that states should always have the right to void unconstitutional federal laws.
So the official press release was known as the XYZ affair, where these three minor French officials, we're calling them X, Y, and Z because we don't like them, told the American diplomats to go away. And here they are portrayed in a political cartoon from a pro-Federalist newspaper. Remember, the Federalists liked the British and hated the French. And this pro-Federalist newspaper depicted these French officials as a three-headed monster with a knife, threatening war. Now, during this undeclared naval war with France, there was a bit of a media campaign. Think of the Hunger Games, where, different sides are trying to spin the conflict in a different way. The Federalists wanted to portray the French as the enemy. The anti-Federalist Americans wanted to portray this as the Federalists trying to use a conflict and spin it for their own self-interest, for their own gain, and depicted the American Federalist as the enemy. And really it was the British that we needed to fear and not the French. Many Federalists feared that the French would use the anti-Federalist to overthrow the American government. And Federalists were suspicious of many immigrants coming into our country because many of these immigrants coming in became involved with the Democratic Republican Party. And many of these immigrants, and some of them, were outspoken critics of the Federalist system. There were French immigrants coming into our country during this undeclared war with France. And so the Federalists, who were in power at this time, pushed through Congress the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. And the Alien Act, the part of this law, raised residency requirements for U.S. citizenship. So now, because of this undeclared war with France, you had to have lived in the country 7 years before you could become a U.S. citizen. And if caught, you could face deportation or jail. But the sedition part, now the reason they wanted to limit French immigration to the United States was because many of these French immigrants that were fleeing the conflict there had differing political ideas. They didn't believe what the Federalists were saying. And so another part of the law was created, the sedition part. And this allowed our government to place people in jail for publishing works or speaking words that either, quote, hindered or lied about the government. And what effectively this did was allowed our government to put in jail editors of Democratic Republican magazines and newspapers and Democratic Republican politicians. We were putting people from the news, journalists, in jail for publishing works that disagreed with the Federalist idea. So if you're looking for a good group project for this week, be some rebel journalists and be some anti-Federalist journalists and Democratic Republican journalists, who were publishing works saying that, hey, maybe this war with France was not so legitimate. And for saying those things, they could be thrown in jail for a period of time.
The ride of their lives. It was London, 2003, when Natalie decided to speak her mind about the impending invasion of Iraq.
Just so you know, we're on the good side with y'all. We do not want war, violence. We're ashamed of the President of the United States.
And those words just
Can you
changed
believe that?
everything for you, right?
Yeah.
I heard this on television, and I went and found it for you guys, where they interviewed bystanders who were reacting to what the Dixie Chicks had said. And again, it was just seared into my memory where this woman, and she had a thick Southern accent, just going to tell you. She said, and I quote, "They need to take old Natalie, strap a bomb to her, send her over Iraq." And Natalie was the lead singer of the Dixie Chicks who had dared speak against the American war in Iraq in 2003 and had dared say something against the President George W. Bush. And they started organizing Dixie Chick burn parties where they would burn their CDs. Scary stuff, right? Would this be considered an infringement on free speech? Do you have the right to criticize our country? Certainly you do. Does that remind you of anything? Now, the Alien and Sedition Acts are certainly a violation of our free speech rights. You know, you may disagree with my politics, I may disagree with yours, but as Patrick Henry once said, we may disagree, but I would fight to the death for your right to disagree. And freedom of speech, well, that's just one of those things that we consider as something that makes us American. We have the right to criticize our leaders, and we should. But the Alien and Sedition Acts allowed our government to throw in prison those who disagreed with their beliefs. And there were a couple of states that refused to enforce this law. And they were the states of Virginia and Kentucky. And they said this law violates the Constitution. We are not going to follow it. And as a state, they decided they were going to reject this law. Well, and so this brings up an issue of states' rights. Can a state reject a law passed by the federal government? Technically, no. But they considered it nullification. And nullification, and the theory it's based on, is the idea from John Locke. Remember, one of those ideas of our country that a government is a social contract. If it violates the social contract, if it violates the people's rights, the government loses its right to be a government. And so Virginia and Kentucky said this law violates our natural rights, it violates the First Amendment, and we ain't going to follow it. And they nullified that law in their own states. Now, perhaps lucky for them, perhaps lucky for all of us, George Washington died. And when he died, Napoleon, leader of France at the time, declared 18 days of mourning in respect for our first president. And this resolved the diplomatic crisis that was going on in Europe. This resolved our beef with France, and the Alien and Sedition Acts were later relaxed. So we got over our disagreements with France because of Napoleon's show of respect for our president. And things were worked out with Virginia and Kentucky. And I suppose it had a happy ending. But this theory of nullification is something that we're going to see again and again leading up to the American Civil War. So today we'll be talking about Chapter 6, Section 3. And the title of this section is Jefferson Alters the Nation's Course. We've been talking about this division. We've been talking about these extreme different views. Anti-Federalist versus Federalist. And of course it became Democratic Republicans versus Federalist. And the United States during Thomas Jefferson's presidency, if you remember, he's the guy who founded the Democratic Republicans, so we're talking about a major party shift in American politics in our early stages. So it's a big shift. But also during this time we're going to be talking about how the United States expanded its borders during, most importantly, the presidency of Thomas Jefferson.
Good job, Seth. You broke it.
That was my fault.
John Adams is a blind, bald, crippled, toothless man who wants to start a war with France. While he's not busy importing mistresses from Europe, he's trying to marry one of his sons to a daughter of King George. Haven't we had enough monarchy?
I'm Thomas Jefferson. I approve this message because John Adams is a hideous, hermaphroditical character, neither the force and firmness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman.
If Thomas Jefferson wins, murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will be openly taught and practiced. The air will be rent with the cries of the distressed. The soil will be soaked with blood, and the nation black with crimes. Are you prepared to see your dwellings in flames, female chastity violated, children writhing on a pike?
I'm John Adams, and I approve this message because Jefferson is the son of a half-breed Indian squaw raised on hoe cakes, and Hamilton is a Creole bastard brat of a Scotch peddler.
Those were real campaign posters, newspaper publications, etc. So you think our campaign is nasty. That was the election of 1800. And this was between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Now you have to remember that John Adams was our second president. So this is the incumbent running for re-election. And this is the president running against the vice president. Do you remember that part? Where Thomas Jefferson came in second place, and so he got to be the vice president, and these two now have to work in the awkward same office, and they're calling each other these things? I mean, really? And that's the election of 1800. And it was a bitter campaign, if you didn't just realize that. And it was a really close campaign as well. In fact, you could argue this was one of the very closest elections in our entire country's history. It was an electoral deadlock. You see, in the popular vote, Thomas Jefferson beat John Adams. However, he came, in the electoral vote, which the Electoral College you learned about in civics, hopefully you still remember something about. So the electoral vote, Thomas Jefferson beat John Adams. However, he came within a dead tie in electoral votes with Aaron Burr. Now, Aaron Burr versus John Adams, dead tie. There is a solution. We can't just have two presidents. There was a time in history where there were two popes and they both sentenced each other to hell. It doesn't work out so well. True story. There were two popes, they both excommunicated each other. In their minds, they sentenced each other to hell. Again, it just doesn't work so well when you have two bosses. And so we have to have a winner. In this case, it goes to the House of Representatives, our Congress. And so if we can't choose a president, if the electorate can't choose a president, we have to decide it in Congress. It's the only time this has ever happened. 35 times Congress voted on who should be our next president. 35 times they came up with a tie. I mean, really, it's scary thinking about it. That our country, that young, we'd only officially started in 1789, and now 11 years later, we can't pick a sodden leader. I mean, we can't. We can't figure out who's supposed to run our country. 35 times. I mean, imagine if the news were printing this today. Imagine if that was on your social media feed. That we can't pick a leader 11 years later. And so Alexander Hamilton realized that for our nation to continue, for us to have a stable government, he would need to change his vote from Aaron Burr, who was a Federalist, to Thomas Jefferson. And so he broke the tie. Jefferson won. Aaron Burr was very upset by what just happened. He should have, by all rights, won the election. Alexander Hamilton ruined it for him. And so what do you do in 1800 if someone disgraces you? Well, first you go knock on the door of their house. You open the door, or your servant opens the door, either way. You then produce a glove, and you slap the person in the face with it.
Although I'm not really going to try and hit her.
Now, what does that mean in 1800? That means someone is going to die. You have invited the other party to a duel. You agree to meet at a set time, and then you meet the next morning. End scene. Very good. Next scene. You meet the next morning. You have agreed upon an objective third party to serve as the referee. The referee will then allow you the choice of weapons. You choose between cannons, spears, knives, swords. You have chosen pistols. A smoothbore single-shot pistol. These usually only have one shot, and then they must be reloaded, and it takes quite a while to reload. You then agree to flip a coin to see who gets to fire first. True story, this actually happened. I'm not making this up. So, select heads or tails.
Heads.
Heads.
Tails.
Tails. And Alexander Hamilton wins the coin toss. He gets the right to fire first. Now, the moderator is going to have you stand back to back. And the moderator is going to count to 10, and you are going to take paces. And 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and 5, and 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now, you are going to turn and fire, but Alexander Hamilton doesn't want to kill Aaron Burr. He believes this needs to be settled peacefully. So Alexander Hamilton fires his shot into the air. Fires the shot into the air. Aaron Burr, seeing the opportunity, levels the gun at Hamilton's chest, shoots and kills him dead. Graveyard dead. Hamilton is dead. However, this is considered a disgraceful act since Hamilton fired his pistol into the air. Aaron Burr shot and killed an unarmed man. So disgraced, Aaron Burr flees off into the territories never to be seen again.
Disgrace.
While Hamilton perhaps saved our country, this revealed a severe flaw in the electoral process. And in fact, it led to the passing of the 12th Amendment. And what this did was allowed electors to cast separate ballots for the president and the vice president. And so the awkwardness of having number 1 and number 2 in the same office was solved. At the same time, it prevented the nasty possibility of a tie in the Electoral College. But I wanted to show you an election map from 1800. Obviously, you can see there are no territories west of the Mississippi, not yet, though we'll add some territory today. But if you also look, you see that the Federalist, John Adams, gained most of his support from the northeastern states. And the Democratic Republican, Thomas Jefferson, had the locked-in support of the southeast, as well as some of the, what we would call western states at that time. They would have been considered a little further west than the coast, were solidly for the Democratic Republicans. And so you can see the beginnings of this sectionalism here exemplified in a presidential election. Just like we will see the continuation of sectionalism, unfortunately, in our presidential election in November. The solid red South versus the blue states, right? Unfortunately, sectionalism still exists. But nonetheless, Thomas Jefferson won the presidency. And it does represent a profound political shift, because the president does have an enormous amount of power. For example, Jefferson replaced all the Federalists in the White House, all these cabinet-level positions, with Democratic Republicans. Jefferson reduced the size of the armed forces, if you read in your book, to a paltry amount. Essentially a handful of officers equipped to train a militia if we are attacked. And so the military was cut to almost nothing. And he cut all social expenses of the government. So the government would not maintain roads, would not do anything to benefit people, period. Our tax dollars in Jefferson's mind were to only go for promoting the common defense and protecting the rights of the American citizens. In doing so, he was able to eliminate all taxes on American people. All taxes. Now, how can you do this? You see, our federal government maintains an interstate highway system, maintains Medicare, Medicaid, maintains Social Security, a large military, and a number of other national concerns. And so how can you just cut all of that? Well, Jefferson said these matters were concerns of the individual state. And the federal government can be small enough to not even have to tax the American citizen. He believed that all taxes necessary for the functioning of a federal government can be collected through international trade by means of tariffs. As president, he reduced the influence of the Bank of the United States, and he was also the first president to take office in Washington, D.C. And he wanted, though wealthy, though an aristocrat, with land and wealth and servants and a great deal of education, he wanted to be seen as a man of the people. And so when he took office in the first southern capital that we've ever seen, he wore work boots and he dressed in working man's clothes. And so he actually chose to walk to his inauguration in working man's clothes, and he chose to dress that way throughout his presidency. So instead of suit and tie, he would have wore Carhartts and boots. And this is beginning what we call the Southern dominance in politics. And so throughout Jefferson's presidency, we do see a true decline in the power of the Federalist Party at this time.
Countrymen. Our third president, Thomas Jefferson, was elected to the high office by the House of Representatives in 1800, since there was a tie in the number of electoral votes between Jefferson and Aaron Burr. When Jefferson succeeded John Adams as president, it was one of the few times in modern history that a peaceful transfer of power from one political party to another had occurred. Jefferson was already well known as the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. As president, he arranged for the Louisiana Purchase from France and more than doubled the size of the United States, and built his own mansion that he called Monticello. He was a champion of political and religious freedom.
Now, as you heard in the video, this was one of the very first times there had ever been a major transition in political power between two such differing ideologies. And it occurred without a single death except for Hamilton. And that's a big deal. That's worth pointing out, that we can have a peaceful transition of power. That if in this election you are not happy with the winner, it would be seen as a horrible thing if you were to commit a violent act as a result. Yet, prior to the election of 1800, it would have been seen as commonplace for people to commit violent actions if there was a major transition in power. Because we're talking about a real change, an ideological shift in our country. Federalists are losing their jobs, they're losing influence, and in fact, the Federalist Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, had served for more than 30 years as the head of our judicial branch. On John Adams' last day as president, he pushed through Congress a law called the Judiciary Act of 1801. So his very last day as president, we call this a lame duck president, meaning that if an incumbent president loses, those last few months from November to February between the election and the inauguration, they are called a lame duck president, meaning the people chose to vote them out of office and they only have a couple months left. And so they're not typically expected to do very much that's important in those last 2 months. They're called a lame duck, meaning nobody wanted them there. It's clear the American people don't want them there. And yet John Adams, instead of sitting and doing nothing or writing his memoirs or whatever, he pushed through a law which added 16 federal judges. And so the hope was this was really his last chance to preserve a legacy of the Federalist Party before Jefferson comes in and just mucks up the whole business. Now, Jefferson argued that these, quote, midnight judges, as he called them, were invalid. That these undelivered appointment papers, these orders that were given on the very last day that he was president, were invalid. In fact, he said, you're just not allowed to do that. It's unconstitutional. And so, the Supreme Court had to investigate. Because after all, it is their job to determine if an action of the president or if an act of Congress is unconstitutional. And so William Marbury, a Federalist, sued in court to have these papers delivered. He argued that even though it was Adams' last day as president, he was still the president of the United States and he still had the right to pick federal judges. In fact, the Judiciary Act of 1789 had already established the right of the Supreme Court to carry out their duties. In fact, it not only created the Supreme Court, it established the specific duties of the Supreme Court. And so John Marshall, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, ruled that this requirement to have these papers delivered was in fact unconstitutional. That you can't just do that on your last day of office. And so this was the very first time that the Supreme Court had convened to override a presidential executive order and to declare it unconstitutional. And that precedent of overriding a president in a matter involving the Constitution is called judicial review. It was the very first time the Supreme Court had ever done that, but even the Supreme Court may override a president or Congress if something they try to do violates the Constitution. Again, that's called judicial review, and that's a very important precedent that was established in this case.
The election in which Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams for president has been called the Revolution of 1800, because that year control of the executive branch of government shifted from the Federalist to the Democratic-Republican Party. Up until 1800, Federalists had always controlled the presidency. After the election of Thomas Jefferson, a revolutionary new set of ideals based on a smaller role for the federal government went into effect. John Adams realized that the loss of the presidency meant that his party's influence had been drastically reduced. And so he used his remaining weeks in office appointing judges who held strong Federalist views so that Federalist ideals would be preserved long into the future. These appointees came to be called the Midnight Judges. One of these men, John Marshall, would serve as the powerful Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for 34 years. And it was under Marshall's guidance that the U.S. Supreme Court finally achieved the same level of power possessed by the executive and legislative branches of government.
Now, during the election of Thomas Jefferson, a great number of Americans began to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. In fact, if you were looking at the election map, it does show that there were these sparsely populated territories between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. But during Jefferson's presidency, these places were growing in population and today are thickly populated areas. I mean, Illinois was a territory at this time. Now it contains Chicago, one of our largest and most important cities. And so from 1800 to 1810, the population of Ohio alone contains, by 1810, 250,000 people. Now, as settlers were moving westward, most were using the Cumberland Gap to reach Ohio. And the Cumberland Gap is a large gap in the Appalachian Mountain chain, large enough and flat enough for settlers to move from the East Coast without having to cross the Appalachian Mountains over into Kentucky and Tennessee. And now the Cumberland Gap is where the Cumberland River flows through. If you've ever passed through that area, think of I-85 from Knoxville connecting to I-26 around Johnson City. If you try to cross the Blue Ridge Mountains here in a wagon, good luck. No roads at all, no trails really to speak of except for a few hunter trails or game trails. And so crossing the Appalachian Mountains by foot in 1800 ain't happening. Yet there was an explorer named Daniel Boone, one of my favorite people in American history, who discovered the Cumberland Gap. He was a hunter. He was a traveler. He explored all of this land, walked all over it, and he found this gap in the mountains large enough for people to move through in large numbers. Think hundreds of thousands of people moving west through this area. He discovered a flat enough valley that people could move through in great numbers. And he spent the rest of his life as a guide getting settlers safely across the mountains through the Cumberland Gap into places like Kentucky and Tennessee with very fertile farmland, helping them get established. So Daniel Boone helped clear the Wilderness Road, which is today the Cumberland Gap. He's an amazing man, amazing stories. You should pick him for your topical project. There are trees all around Middle Tennessee and throughout the mountains with his name carved on them. In fact, there's one in the Big South Fork in what's a little place, you think here is small. Think of the Valley of the Three Forks of the Wolf in the Big South Fork. And you'll find, if you dig around enough, a tree where it says D. Boone killed Barr on tree in 18 something something. Anyway, neat stuff. I think he's amazing. So meanwhile, we've been talking about foreign affairs yesterday. And you may remember that Napoleon tried to conquer the world. And that European countries were so concerned about this, in fact, they gave up many of their overseas possessions and began selling off their colonies and making deals with the United States to avoid conflict with us because they wanted to focus their efforts on Napoleon. Well, Napoleon was also giving up his overseas possessions. And when Louisiana was returned to France as a result of a deal with Spain, Thomas Jefferson was afraid of Napoleon as well because he had essentially conquered Western Europe. But a turn of events worked out in our favor. A slave colony called Haiti rose up in rebellion and won their independence. They were a French colony, and then they became independent, and the slaves rose up and killed their masters and declared Haiti an independent nation. And as a result, Napoleon was so frustrated from dealing with that insurrection that he realized that it wasn't worth the resources to maintain an overseas colony, especially if the United States were going to continue to move into these territories. And so he sold off the Louisiana territories which in a moment you'll see how big this is, to the United States for a few $1 million. I think $15 million was the agreed upon sum. And this doubled the size of the United States. Now, $15 million was a lot more back then, and Napoleon needed the money to continue to fight this war and finance his campaigns. But the Louisiana Purchase was perhaps one of our biggest wins here. There was one problem. No one really knew the area that well. Doubling the size of the United States, that's huge. And yes, there were Native Americans living there. And so we needed to know, among these Native American tribes, who would be friendly, who would work with us, who would cooperate and live peacefully with us, and who might try to stab us in the back, who might try to kill us, etc. But also, are these lands safe? I mean, are there grizzly bears there? Are they going to kill us all? Are these lands hospitable? Can we set up farms? Can we build roads? Can we settle this area? Or is it some kind of Siberia that we purchased? You know, we need to know information, beta about this land before people are going to begin to move there. And so Thomas Jefferson personally appointed Lewis and Clark to lead the Corps of Discovery. And I think this is an amazing story in itself. Lewis and Clark were tasked with exploring the Louisiana Territory, which was the size of the existing United States at this point. So they were said, go, wander the country. We need you to make maps. We need you to find an overland route to the Pacific Ocean. We need you to gather as much information as you can. We need to know about the people living there, the plants living there, the animals living there. Are there giant beasts that are going to eat us all? And with them traveled a Native American woman named Sacagawea, who served as their interpreter. She didn't speak all of the languages, but they had enough of a common thread she could often figure it out. And she served as their guide. In all honesty, they probably wouldn't have made it without her. And so next I just wanted to show you the Louisiana Territory. And this also shows you a little about the Lewis and Clark expedition. For example, the expedition started in St. Louis, like I said, an important city. But the Louisiana Purchase here you see put next to the existing United States is almost as big as the existing United States. And by the end of their journey, and you don't have to read all of this, but by the end of their journey, they will have spent 2 years exploring the Louisiana Territory. They will have made it all the way to the Pacific Ocean. They spent a winter at the Pacific Ocean at Fort Clatsop, a fort they established, and they will make it back. Not all of them, but most of them. Make it back. And they produce maps and information, and they write books, and they're famous, and everybody considers them a hero. Because now they have some of the most usable information of what might as well have been another planet at that time. In fact, we even made a movie about these guys. This was Chris Farley's last movie before he died. It's called Almost Heroes. You should watch it. It's silly, it's funny, but it follows the story of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And that's Dave Chappelle and David Arquette, if you don't know.
One thing you will discover when you get next to one another is everybody needs some elbow room, elbow room. It's nice when you're kind of cozy, but not when you're tangled nose to nosy. Oh, everybody needs some elbow, needs a little elbow room. That's how it was in the early days of the USA. The people kept coming to settle, though the East was the only place there was to go. The president was Thomas Jefferson. He made a deal with Napoleon. How'd you like to sell a mile or two?
Or 3 or 100 or 1,000.
And so in 1803 the Louisiana Territory was sold to us without a fuss and gave us lots of elbow room. Oh, elbow room, elbow room. Got we got to get us some elbow room. It's the West or bust. In God we trust. There's a new land out there. Lewis and Clark volunteered to go. Goodbye, good luck, wear your overcoat. They prepared for good times and for bad, and for bad. They hired a Sacagawea to be their guide. She led them all across the countryside, reached the coast, and found the most elbow room we've ever had. The way was opened up for folks with bravery. There were plenty of fights to win land rights, but the West was meant to be. It was a manifest destiny. The trappers, traders, and the peddlers, the politicians and the settlers, they got there by any way they could. The gold rush trampled down the wilderness, the railroads spread across from east to west, and soon the rest was opened up for good. And now we jet from east to west, goodbye New York, LOLA. But it took those early folks to open up the way. Now we've got a lot of room to be growing from sea to shining sea. Guess that we have got our elbow room, elbow room. But if there should ever come a time when we're crowded up together, I'm sure we'll find some elbow room up on the moon. Oh, elbow room, elbow room. Got to get us some elbow room. It's the moon or bust. In God we trust. There's a new land up there.
All right, just for fun, and you might see this on your quiz, which statement best, the key word there is best, remember that's the big trick on a lot of your test questions, explains why the exploration of Louisiana Purchase was important to the future of the United States. This is a tough one, because here's the truth. All of these are correct. However, one is better than the others. Yes? Perhaps? See, I don't think you'll see this one on your quiz. I think long ago I took it away for this very reason, but the state once included this on the final exam. It was B. Yeah. Just in all fairness, I think I removed that one from your quiz because I was like, really? Because I would have chose D, honestly, but anyway. The state chose B.
You should
but yeah.
just make a joke, just put them all right.
Yeah.
And just...
Okay, so today we'll be talking about Chapter 6, Section 4, and the title of this is the War of 1812. And so today we'll be talking about how war broke out again between the United States and Great Britain, and this time in 1812. This time again we get to talk about the White House being burned down. Oh wait, it's the White House this time. It's not the Capitol in Philadelphia, but the same principle. They burned down our Capitol again. So here we go again, and the British are going to kick our butts again. But it's not all bad, though technically this war was a stalemate and we didn't decisively win. Some people call this our second war for independence because the British did essentially leave us alone after this because they had bigger problems, but we'll get into that. Now, first off, why were we even talking about war with Britain? Because of France's war with everyone, particularly with Britain. There was a British blockade around the coast of France, attempting to seal French ports to prevent British ships from entering. The goal here was to starve out the French and drive them into a peace agreement with Great Britain. And so meanwhile, Britain as well as France were in the process of seizing American ships. Since Washington had declared neutrality, we were attempting business as usual, which means we conducted quite a bit of international trade with both Britain and France. However, since these nations were at war, they would steal American cargo headed for France, or French ships would steal American cargo headed for Britain. This was a way that they could cut the supply lines to either enemy state. However, the problem is we're stuck in the middle. because we are the country representing the cargo. It's our cargo they're stealing. It's our sailors they're kidnapping. And that's an act of war, folks. Because perhaps even worse than stealing cargo belonging to a sovereign nation is stealing people belonging to a sovereign nation. That's what we call impressment. You may also have heard the word Shanghai. It's another term used for impressing American citizens into British service or into French service. British ships were boarding American vessels without permission, pointing guns at our men, and forcing them to work for the British. You can call that kidnapping, you can call it Shanghaiing. The formal term is impressment. The president's response was to order Congress to declare an embargo, a ban on exports. The embargo meant that we would not sell any goods to Britain because they were stealing our stuff. They were kidnapping our people. And so we just said, we're done. We're not selling you anything. The hope was that this embargo would hurt Britain's economy. However, in fact, it actually hurt the United States economy because we were a lot newer and we relied on that international trade exclusively with Britain, a lot more than Britain needed us. So Congress wound up lifting it to a degree. We were going to ban all exports with all countries, remain neutral, and become entirely economically independent. However, that worked out badly for us, so we did remove the ban on exports with the exception of Britain and France because we were at war with China.
Trade was important to America in the early 1800s. Many Americans sold crops and raw materials to foreign countries. But with France and Britain fighting a war against each other, America was caught in the middle. While America tried to remain neutral, both Britain and France began capturing American ships to block trade with their enemy. Making matters worse, Britain, in need of sailors, began capturing American sailors and forcing them to serve in the British Navy. Jefferson responded with an embargo. The United States refused to trade with any foreign country. But the embargo hurt American farmers and merchants more than it hurt either Britain or France, so it was finally lifted. Meanwhile, American settlers continued moving westward, but this caused problems for the Native Americans living on those lands. In 1805, Native American groups in the Old Northwest joined together to stop the settlers and prevent the destruction of their homelands and way of life. Britain also wanted to stop America's westward expansion, so it supplied the Native Americans with guns. Tensions between the United States and Britain were high when James Madison became president in 1809. Americans were angry over Britain's support of Native American fighters in the West and the continued impressment of American sailors. Congress declared war on Britain in 1812. When the War of 1812 began, Britain was still fighting the French, but the military cutbacks Thomas Jefferson had made limited America's ability to wage war. By 1814, Britain had defeated Napoleon and turned its full attention to the United States. In August, British troops marched into Washington, D.C. and set fire to many government buildings. Both sides eventually decided it was time to end the costly war. They began peace talks and signed a treaty in December of 1814. Some people called the War of 1812 the Second War of Independence. They felt that by standing up to Britain, the United States had finally secured its independence from Britain, and Americans' confidence in their country soared.
Okay, so the first act of war we talked about was the impressment of American sailors and the theft of American cargo by the British. And the second, while Americans were busy moving westward and winning wars against the Native Americans to take their land, one of our famous generals, William Henry Harrison, who would actually later become President of the United States for a brief time until he died, was William Henry Harrison. And he had made several land deals with Native American chiefs. And yet, the chief of the Shawnee tribe, named Tecumseh, attempted to form a confederacy or an alliance between neighboring Native American tribes. And Tecumseh's confederacy hoped to rid their lands of American invaders. They urged their people to return to traditional beliefs and practices and give up any religion or culture they had learned from the American people. They attempted to negotiate with Harrison at first to pressure him to leave their lands and their people alone. In fact, they began to negotiate with the British and asked the British for help in what will probably become a war between Tecumseh's confederacy and the American people. Now, many tribes didn't join this confederacy. In fact, many were content attempting to assimilate and live beside the United States. However, Tecumseh and his allies insisted on Native American independence. And so they went to war with William Henry Harrison and his military detachment. Harrison actually ran for president on his laurels from this war with the Native American Confederacy. At the Battle of Tippecanoe, Harrison was a war hero. Though he suffered heavy losses, he defeated Tecumseh's army. And when they were going over the remains and searching through the battle, and they confiscated weapons that were made by the British, that were being used by American enemies against us. The British had armed our enemies to help them fight us. The second act of war. And so meanwhile, the war hawks were members of Congress that favored war with Great Britain because of these two reasons. And so for that reason, we use the term hawk when referring to someone who favors war. And by contrast, we use the term dove when someone prefers peace. A dove is the international symbol of peace. And hawk now is associated with a desire for conflict. So meanwhile, James Madison, President of the United States at this time, chooses war. It is his responsibility, after all, to send soldiers and to give that order. And he did so because he believed that Britain was crippling U.S. trade. And yet, while we had perhaps sound reason for going to war with Britain, we were very unprepared. The army was unprepared. It was very small. We had a very minimal standing army, as we learned about yesterday with Thomas Jefferson. And Britain had the most powerful navy on the planet. And so, early in the war, the British were kicking our butts. They won in Detroit, they won in Canada, and generally were winning the first part of the battle. We did score some significant victories, such as on Lake Erie. Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry defeated the British there and won several battles and had a successful Canadian campaign. And Native Americans were caught up on both sides of the conflict. Tecumseh and his confederacy fought for the British, and he was later killed in battle. Now at sea, we were woefully unprepared. We had only 16 ships in our entire Navy. 16 in the entire Navy, representing a country of over 4 million people. 16 ships. Now, I don't know exactly how many Britain had, but I would say it's close to 100 or more versus 16. I mean, if ever there was a hopeless cause, that's it. Now, only 3 of these ships were of the class that we would consider worthy of going toe-to-toe with the British. Frigate class. We had 3 capable of actually holding a broadside battle with a general British ship. 3 for our entire country. So it's pretty sad, obviously. And so the British effectively blockaded all U.S. ports along the East Coast. So they were able to cut us off rather easily. Now, this successful Canadian campaign, oh yes, we invaded Canada. That has actually happened. In 1812, we made a full-scale invasion of Canada and we burned their capital city to the ground. It was still British soil, and it was during the war with Britain, so it was considered a successful raid on a British territory. And in retaliation, in 1814, in the very last year of the war, the British Army raided and burned towns along the Atlantic coast. In particular, they burned Washington, D.C. to the ground. And James Madison had to hop on Air Force One carriage and get out of there, right? He had to flee the American capital. Can you imagine? The American president has now fled the American capital. Where are those rednecks with shotguns when we need them? And so this was in retaliation for the burning of York and towns in Canada. Now, here's an interesting footnote in history for you. Shortly after the burning of the White House, we negotiated a settlement and agreed to an armistice, otherwise a stalemate, with Great Britain. But before word could be reached to Andrew Jackson, who was an American military general fighting in the southern part of the United States, before word could spread to him, he attacked and defeated a larger British force in the city of New Orleans. And so after the war was over, we won a glorious victory. And so generally this war was characterized by the fact that we had a tiny navy that wasn't capable of actually fighting against the British, and generally it ended with our capital being burned to the ground, and the fact that we were lucky that Britain had bigger problems because Napoleon was still picking a fight in Europe. However, we get to say the last battle went to us, and it was a glorious one. Jackson led an army against a British force that was nearly twice his size and won a resounding victory in New Orleans.
The allegiance of these first new Americans, the New Orleanians, would quickly be tested in the War of 1812 under the leadership of General Andrew Jackson. The eyes of country and world now focused upon their response to an imminent British attack upon New Orleans.
It is no mere coincidence that as the United States is getting ready to go to war with Great Britain, that's a good time to bring Louisiana into the Union and make sure that the residents of Louisiana are full participants in the nation.
And we can see this in the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. People were wondering, people like Andrew Jackson were wondering, how is the local population going to react to this battle? Are they going to actually side with the British against the United States, or will they actually help defend the colony? And the truth is they helped defend the colony. And in fact, the crucial people at the Battle of New Orleans were the Creole artillerymen. And so this showed that now the colonists in Louisiana considered themselves Americans.
The Americans from Louisiana had helped rout Great Britain in the Battle of New Orleans. It was a signal to the world of America's growing power. Farther upriver, enterprising Americans were pouring into the fertile regions of the upper Mississippi Valley. Like Lewis and Clark, these brave pioneers were a symbol of American perseverance. But fueled by their own hasty penetration into the frontier, settlers found themselves facing hostile Indian attacks.
People were greatly concerned about this becoming a routine thing with the Indians, attacking these outposts.
Much of the North American West remained a territory that was under the control of Indians. As far as they understood things, white settlers from the U.S. were the most land-hungry, most violent, most difficult people in North America.
The Louisiana Purchase gives Jefferson this opportunity to think differently about how to handle the relationships between Indians and whites, if you will. And unfortunately, the idea that he comes up with leads ultimately to removal and to all the destruction that happens to the Indian tribes and culture in the 19th century.
Jefferson's idea was to push Indians west of the Mississippi River, clearing the eastern banks for farming and trapping settlements. But as the United States began to expand westward, more and more Native Americans were displaced. The lands of the present-day state of Iowa were named after the Iowa Indians, who were pushed westward to accommodate an American land rush. And the Sioux Indians in Minnesota were moved to reservations in Nebraska. These stories would play out again and again in this new American land.
The instruments which we have just signed will cause no tears to be shed. They prepare ages of happiness for innumerable generations of human creatures. Robert Livingston.
But many tears and blood drops would be shed following the purchase. First for Native Americans, and now for another group of oppressed people who desired freedom, slaves in America.
And so peace was made at the Treaty of Ghent, an agreement signed on Christmas Day of 1814. And this declared an armistice, or an end to the fighting. An armistice simply means that both sides agree to a mutual stalemate based on certain conditions. It does not resolve all of the issues that we had with Great Britain. We cannot call this a resounding American victory, but we certainly don't have to call it a defeat. And the agreement made between the two nations that would resolve the conflict was that commercial treaties could reopen trade between Great Britain and the United States. Even though we were at war with France, even though they were at war with France still, we can resume business. A separate treaty called the Rush-Bagot Agreement limited British warships on the Great Lakes. They still maintained a small standing army on the Great Lakes because that was the U.S. border with Canada, and after all, we had invaded Canada during this war, and Canada was still a British territory. And then also it was agreed upon that we would have a northern boundary of the Louisiana Territory. It was set at the 49th parallel, and so that is now the northern boundary of the United States. Britain and the United States also agreed to jointly occupy the Oregon territories. And later, in the mid-1800s, President James K. Polk will run successfully for president on the promise to go to war with Great Britain if they don't give us the Oregon Territory. Different country, right? Different time. Literally, James K. Polk's campaign slogan was 46-40 or fight. Give us Oregon and Washington or we will go to war with Great Britain. And that's how he got elected president. Can you imagine? What if one of our candidates today were to promise to go to war with a country unless they gave up some of their territory? Everybody would laugh. We'd go, that's ridiculous. Maybe. I hope. Well, I would assume that people would go, that's ridiculous. But nonetheless, in 1846, a candidate won the presidency on the promise to go to war if another country didn't give us their territory. So different times, I suppose. All right, so your fun little practice quiz for the day. In 1812, how did Madison respond to Britain's harmful actions against American trade? Anybody? Yes, C. Eventually he decided to go to war. Jefferson declared the trade embargo. We are the ones who invaded Canada, and Britain was the one committing impressment against us, so war would have been the only option.